Lazarus had just walked out of his own tomb. Crowds were pouring into Bethany just to see the man who had been dead for 4 days. But while the whole town celebrated the miracle, a small group of religious leaders was already meeting in secret, planning how to make Lazarus disappear again. This time, permanently. Bethany was a village of maybe 200 people, less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, close enough that you could walk there before sundown. And in the days after the tomb opened, that small village became the most dangerous place in Judea, not because of what had happened inside it, but because of who had seen it happen. Nobody in Bethany could stop talking about it. Neighbors who had brought food to Martha during the 7 days of mourning were now standing in the street, staring at Lazarus like he was a ghost. Except ghosts don't eat, and Lazarus was eating. He was walking, talking, embracing his sisters Mary and Martha like a man who had simply returned from a long trip, except the trip had been death itself. But 40 minutes away, inside the chambers of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, none of that joy existed. What existed was fear. Real, political, immediate fear. Because a dead man walking through the streets of Bethany wasn't just a miracle, it was a problem that could bring the entire Roman occupation crashing down on their heads. This is the story nobody tells you about Lazarus. Not the story of the miracle, the story of what the miracle cost him. 4 days earlier, Lazarus had been sealed inside a rock-cut tomb outside Bethany, wrapped in burial cloths soaked in nearly 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, the amount John's Gospel says Nicodemus later brought for a different burial, but a similar quantity was standard practice for a man from a family wealthy enough to own a private tomb. The stench of decomposition was already noticeable. Martha herself warned Jesus about it before the stone was even rolled away. 4 days meant something specific in Jewish burial custom of the period. Rabbinic tradition held that a person's soul lingered near the body for 3 days, hoping to return. But by the 4th day, the soul departed for good because the body had begun to visibly decay. 4 days meant final. 4 days meant there was no ambiguity, no chance this was a coma or a misdiagnosis. 4 days meant dead. And then Jesus called his name, and Lazarus walked out, still bound in the wrappings, according to the text, moving like a man wrapped head to foot in cloth, and someone had to physically unwrap him before he could function normally again. The witnesses who saw it happen didn't stay quiet. Many of the Judeans who had come to comfort Mary believed in Jesus that day, right there at the tomb. But the text is specific. Some of them didn't celebrate. Some of them went straight to the Pharisees to report what they'd seen. That single detail is the hinge the entire story turns on. Not everyone who watched a dead man walk out of a tomb was moved to faith. Some were moved to alarm. Within what was likely days, the chief priests and Pharisees convened the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of 71 elders who held religious and significant civil authority over Jewish life under Roman oversight. Their reaction to the miracle wasn't debate over whether it happened. According to the gospel account, they didn't even question the resurrection itself. Their concern was strategic. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation.
That's not a theological objection. That's a political calculation from men who understood exactly how fragile their arrangement with Rome actually was. Judea in this period operated under an uneasy peace. The Roman prefect allowed the Jewish council limited self-governance specifically because it kept the population manageable. A popular uprising, even one triggered by religious enthusiasm rather than armed rebellion, could bring in Roman legions. And Roman legions crushing an uprising in Jerusalem was not a hypothetical fear. It had happened before in the region, and it would happen catastrophically within the following 4 decades.
Caiaphas, the sitting high priest that year, ended the debate with a single sentence that the gospel writer treats as an unintentional prophecy. It was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. From that day on, the council moved from discussion to active planning. They were no longer asking whether to act against Jesus, they were asking how. But here's what almost never gets said out loud in Sunday teaching about this passage. Jesus wasn't the only target. Lazarus was too. Word of what happened in Bethany didn't stay contained. Passover was approaching, which meant Jerusalem's population was about to swell from its normal size to several times that, as pilgrims arrived from across the region and beyond, from Galilee, from the Decapolis, from communities of the Jewish diaspora as far as Rome and Alexandria. A dead man raised just outside the city walls, weeks before the feast, was the kind of story that traveled at the speed pilgrims could walk.
6 days before Passover, Jesus returned to Bethany for a dinner in his honor.
Lazarus reclined at the table. The detail is preserved specifically because it mattered to the original audience. Reclining at a formal meal was the posture of someone fully healthy, fully restored, fully alive, not a man convalescing from an ordeal. Martha served, and Mary, in an act that scandalized at least one disciple watching, took roughly a pint of pure nard, an imported perfume worth close to a full year's wages for a common laborer, and poured it over Jesus' feet, filling the house with its fragrance. Word spread that Jesus was there, and when the crowd came, they weren't only coming for Jesus. The text says it plainly. A large crowd learned Jesus was in Bethany, and came not only because of him, but to see Lazarus, the man he had raised from the dead. Lazarus wasn't just a bystander in this story anymore. He had become the proof. Living, breathing, reclining at dinner proof that something had happened in that tomb that defied every category the Sanhedrin had for controlling public belief. And that made him dangerous in a way no sermon could be. A teaching can be argued against. A parable can be reinterpreted. But a man who was verifiably dead for 4 days, now sitting at a dinner table eating bread, there was no theological workaround for that. The only solution left on the table was to remove the evidence. If stories like this, the ones buried inside familiar Bible passages, the details most teaching skips right past, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing helps this channel keep digging them up every week.
This is the verse that almost nobody preaches on because it's uncomfortable in a way most Easter season content isn't built to hold. The chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, because on account of him, many of the Judeans were going away and believing in Jesus. Read that again. The chief priests, the same council that had just condemned Jesus to death, made a second, separate, deliberate decision to kill a private citizen. Not a rabbi, not a threat to Roman order in any active sense. A man whose only offense was continuing to exist after he'd been raised from the dead. There's something almost darkly absurd about it if you sit with it long enough. You cannot unresurrect someone through argument. You cannot debate a body back into a tomb. So the chief priests reached for the only tool that could actually erase the evidence. They'd have to kill him twice. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, doesn't record this specific plot, but his broader accounts of the Sanhedrin's willingness to eliminate perceived threats to the temple establishment, including through irregular proceedings, line up with exactly this kind of behind closed doors decision. And it fits a documented pattern. Threats to institutional control in Second Temple Judea were rarely handled through open trial. They were handled quietly, before the threat could grow into something the council could no longer contain. We don't have a verse that says Lazarus found out about the plot directly, but it's difficult to imagine he didn't. Bethany was small. The council's hostility toward Jesus was public knowledge by this point. The text says explicitly that the chief priests had given orders that anyone who knew where Jesus was should report it so they could arrest him. If that level of surveillance existed around Jesus, it's reasonable to assume whispers reached Bethany about Lazarus too. He was living at this point as a marked man in his own hometown, resurrected from physical death only to spend his remaining days as a fugitive from a very human, very political death sentence.
Scripture goes quiet on Lazarus after this point.
The canonical Gospels never tell us directly whether the plot succeeded, whether he fled, or how the rest of his life played out. That silence has left centuries of tradition to fill in the gap, and the traditions that survive are strikingly different depending on which branch of the early church preserved them.
In the Eastern Christian tradition, particularly preserved in Cyprus, Lazarus is said to have left Judea entirely, sailing away from the region where the council's authority could reach him, and settled on the island, where he reportedly lived another 30 years and eventually became the first bishop of Kition, modern-day Larnaca. A tomb identified with him has been venerated there since at least the late 4th century, and a church built over it still stands today. One later tradition claims that when the apostles Paul and Barnabas visited Cyprus, they consecrated Lazarus as bishop specifically because he was already known there as a man death itself had failed to hold on to. The Western tradition, preserved mainly in medieval France, tells an almost entirely different story. That Lazarus, along with his sisters Mary and Martha, was set adrift by hostile authorities in a boat without oars or sails, and providentially landed near modern-day Marseille, where he became the region's first bishop before eventually being martyred. The two traditions can't both be historically precise. They disagree on geography, on the manner of his departure, on how his life ended. But what they agree on, remarkably, is the underlying shape of the story. Lazarus did not get to live out a quiet, ordinary life in Bethany after his resurrection. He was forced out. He became someone who had to build an entirely new life somewhere else, carrying with him the singular, unrepeatable experience of having crossed the boundary of death and returned.
There's a medieval legend, most famously associated with Eastern Orthodox iconography and later repeated in various forms across European folklore, that Lazarus never laughed again after being raised. That for the remaining decades of his life, his face carried the weight of having seen what exists on the other side of the grave. And that only once, according to one version of the legend, did he almost smile. When he saw a man stealing a clay pot and murmured that clay steals clay. Historians can't verify the legend as fact, but it endured for a reason. It captured something people intuitively understood about Lazarus's second life, that surviving your own death doesn't leave you unchanged. It leaves you marked.
What makes the Lazarus story so uncomfortable, when you actually sit with the full text instead of just the highlight reel version, is that it refuses to give you a clean, happy ending. Most retellings stop at the tomb. Jesus called, Lazarus walked out, the crowd rejoiced, credits roll. But John's Gospel keeps writing past that moment specifically to show you the cost. The miracle didn't just restore a life, it marked a man for a second execution. It turned a private family tragedy into a matter of state security. It meant that the very thing that proved Jesus' authority over death was also the thing that made continuing to live the most dangerous thing Lazarus could do. There's an argument to be made, and serious biblical scholars have made versions of it, that Lazarus' story sits as a quiet parallel to the story of Jesus himself. Two men marked for death by the same council, for the same underlying reason, at the same moment in history. One sentence would be carried out at Golgotha within weeks, the other, as far as the biblical record tells us, never was. Not because the council changed its mind, but because history simply moved past it, toward the cross, toward the empty tomb that would matter even more than Lazarus's had. And maybe that's the real weight of this story. Not that Lazarus was raised, but that being raised didn't make him safe. It made him a target for the same forces that were already circling Jesus. Coming back from the dead didn't end his story with peace. It started a second, quieter, more dangerous chapter, one the Gospels only give us a single verse to describe, and one tradition has spent 2,000 years trying to finish. If you want more of these, the verses buried in plain sight that most teaching walks straight past, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And there's a new one going up every week. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you were Lazarus, knowing your own resurrection had made you a marked man, would you have stayed in Bethany or run? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I'm always curious how differently people answer this.